Virginia Freeman. On a December afternoon in 1981, Virginia Ginger Freeman, a 40-year-old real estate agent in College Station, Texas, prepared to show a vacant property in the rural outskirts of town. A devoted wife and mother, Freeman had built a reputation for her warm professionalism and tireless work ethic in the competitive Texas real estate market. She was known among colleagues as someone who would go the extra mile for clients, often showing properties alone to accommodate buyers' schedules. That Tuesday, December 1st, would mark her final showing. When Freeman failed to return home that evening, her family immediately sensed something had gone terribly wrong. Her body was discovered behind the vacant home she had been scheduled to show, and the scene told a harrowing story. Freeman had been struck on the head, her hyoid bone broken from force, and sustained numerous wounds to her neck. The level of intensity suggested deep rage, yet investigators found defensive wounds indicating she had fought fiercely for her life. Curiously, there were no signs of the type of assault that often accompanies such incidents. Detective Dick Gullidge, who worked the case from the beginning, later recalled the scene's brutality. The level of harm inflicted went far beyond what would have been necessary, suggesting something deeply personal or uncontrolled. The investigation moved quickly at first, with detectives pursuing every lead. The property had been listed publicly, meaning anyone could have called to arrange a viewing. Investigators theorized the perpetrator may have posed as a potential buyer, using the isolated location to his advantage. Forensic teams carefully collected evidence from beneath Freeman's fingernails, hoping it might yield clues about her attacker. In the early 1980s, however, DNA technology remained in its infancy. The biological material was carefully preserved, but without the sophisticated analysis tools that would emerge in later decades, investigators could do little more than catalog and store it. The case grew cold as leads dried up and years turned into decades. Freeman's family never stopped pushing for answers. They watched as forensic science evolved, holding on to hope that one day technology would catch up to their tragedy. That day came in 2018, when investigators decided to revisit the evidence using modern genetic genealogy techniques. The DNA, extracted from beneath Freeman's fingernails, was uploaded to genealogical databases, and technicians began building family trees from distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information. Through painstaking research, they identified a possible suspect, James Otto Earhart, who had been 38 years old at the time of Freeman's passing. But there was a significant complication. Earhart had been executed by the state of Texas in 1999 for an entirely separate case involving a young person. To confirm the DNA match with absolute certainty, investigators needed a direct sample from Earhart himself. In an extraordinary step, authorities obtained permission to exhume Earhart's body in 2019. The femur bone was extracted and tested, and the results came back with 100% certainty. James Otto Earhart had taken Virginia Freeman's life. Sheriff Chris Kirk announced the findings publicly, stating investigators knew with complete certainty who had been responsible. The confirmation brought Freeman's family a measure of closure they had sought for nearly 4 decades, though it came with the bitter knowledge that Earhart would never face justice, specifically for what he had done to Virginia. But this case of opportunity would pale compared to what happened when someone closer to home became a suspect. Eve Wilkowitz. Eve Wilkowitz was 20 years old in March of 1980, full of life and ambition as she worked as a secretary at a prestigious Manhattan publishing house. Those who knew Eve described her as outgoing and warm, someone who loved horses, music, reading, and drawing. She was particularly devoted to her role as big sister to Irene, cherishing their close bond. Eve lived in Bay Shore, New York, and commuted daily to her Manhattan job via the Long Island Railroad, a routine journey shared by thousands of suburban workers. On the evening of March 22, 1980, Eve's train arrived late into Bay Shore Station. She began the short walk to her apartment, a route she had traveled countless times before. But she never made it home. When Irene couldn't reach her sister, panic set in quickly. 3 days later, on March 25th, Eve's body was discovered in a yard not far from her apartment. The circumstances indicated she had been forcibly taken and harmed, ending the young woman's promising life in an act of senseless brutality. The investigation launched immediately, with detectives canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing potential witnesses. The proximity to Eve's home suggested someone local might be involved, but without clear suspects or physical evidence that could be meaningfully processed with 1980s technology, the case stalled. Eve's family, particularly her younger sister Irene, refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Year after year, Irene contacted law enforcement, keeping Eve's name in front of investigators and urging them to re-examine the evidence as new technologies emerged. The breakthrough came in 2021, when investigators decided to employ a newer approach: genetic genealogy through consumer DNA databases. The FBI worked with genealogists to upload the perpetrator's DNA profile to public databases, where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to trace their ancestry. This technique had revolutionized cold case investigations since 2018, when it famously helped identify the Golden State perpetrator. For Eve's case, the genealogical work led investigators to family members of someone named Herbert Rice. Rice had lived just blocks from Eve's apartment in 1980. He had a history of minor non-violent arrests, but nothing that would have flagged him as someone capable of such harm. Crucially, Rice's wife had actually evicted him from their home shortly before Eve's disappearance, suggesting he may have been in an unstable emotional state. Prosecutors would later describe the encounter as a crime of opportunity: wrong place, wrong time. And a young woman walking home alone became a target for someone spiraling. There was just one problem. Herbert Rice had passed away from illness in 1991, more than 3 decades before investigators identified him. To confirm the DNA match with absolute certainty, authorities obtained permission to exhume Rice's body. Rice's son voluntarily provided a DNA sample as well, which helped establish the family connection. When the exhumation analysis came back in 2022, it was definitive. Herbert Rice had been responsible for Eve Wilkowitz's ending. District Attorney Ray Tierney announced the resolution at a press conference, praising what he called Irene's unbelievable dedication to her sister's memory. After 42 years of uncertainty, Irene finally had her answer. In an emotional statement, while one family fought for answers for over 40 years, another case would reveal betrayal from an unexpected source. Linda Slayton. In September of 1981, Linda Slayton was a 31-year-old single mother in Lakeland, Florida, working hard to rebuild her life after escaping a difficult marriage. Linda had 2 sons, Jeff, 15, and Tim, 12, who were her entire world. Friends and family described her as someone everyone liked, a warm and caring person who had survived hardship and was determined to create a better future for her boys. She had recently begun dating again and was slowly finding her footing as an independent woman. Tim had recently joined a youth football team, and his assistant coach, 20-year-old Joseph Mills, had become a familiar presence in their lives. Mills seemed like an upstanding young man, married with his own family, dedicated to mentoring young players and always willing to help out. On the evening of September 4th, 1981, Mills gave Tim a ride home after football practice, dropping him off at the family's apartment. Later that night, after Linda had hosted some friends and everyone had gone home, something terrible unfolded while Jeff and Tim slept in their rooms. Linda was attacked in her own apartment by someone who had entered through a window. The perpetrator had apparently hidden in a closet, waiting for the right moment. The encounter was brutal, ending with Linda being harmed with a coat hanger. Her sons woke the next morning to discover their mother had been taken from them in the most horrific way imaginable. The trauma of finding their mother would haunt Jeff and Tim for the rest of their lives. Investigators immediately began processing the crime scene. Evidence was collected, including biological material that would prove crucial decades later. In 1984, a palm print found at the scene was analyzed and entered into records, but it matched no one in the system at that time. Detectives interviewed everyone in Linda's life, including Joseph Mills, but found no immediate evidence linking anyone to the scene. The case grew cold, leaving Jeff and Tim to grow up without their mother and without answers about who had taken her from them. Years turned into decades, and the Slayton brothers never stopped wondering who had destroyed their family. Then, in 2019, the case caught the attention of forensic genealogist Cece Moore, who had gained fame for her work on the Golden State case and other high-profile cold cases. Moore's team analyzed the DNA evidence and began building family trees through genetic genealogy databases, looking for distant relatives of the perpetrator. The process was painstaking, requiring months of research to trace lineages and narrow down potential suspects. The genealogical work led investigators to Joseph Mills, Tim's former assistant football coach. The revelation sent shockwaves through the case. Mills had been in their home that very evening, had dropped Tim off just hours before Linda's life ended. Detectives obtained Mills' DNA from discarded trash and compared it to the crime scene evidence. When they cross-referenced this with the 1984 palm print records, everything aligned. The evidence was overwhelming. Joseph Mills, the trusted coach, had returned to the Slayton home after dropping Tim off and had committed an unspeakable act against the boy's mother. Mills was arrested in 2019, nearly 4 decades after the incident. During interrogation, he initially denied everything, then attempted to claim the encounter had been consensual, a claim investigators immediately refuted based on the forensic evidence and the nature of the scene. The biological evidence told a clear story of force and resistance, completely contradicting Mills' attempt to rewrite history. The case went to trial in 2022. By this time, Jeff and Tim Slayton were middle-aged men who had spent their entire adult lives carrying the trauma of that September night. When Mills pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life without parole, the brothers finally had their day in court. Jeff confronted Mills directly, demanding to know why he had taken their mama from them. Tim called Mills a cold-hearted individual, expressing the rage and grief that had built up over 38 years. While that case involved a betrayal of trust, the next story would show how a simple, anonymous letter could crack a case wide open. Anna Kane. Anna Kane was 26 years old in October of 1988, a young mother of 3 trying to navigate life's challenges in Reading, Pennsylvania. Anna's life had taken difficult turns. She struggled with substance issues and occasionally engaged in activities to support herself financially. Despite her circumstances, those who knew Anna described her as caring and honest, someone trying her best for her children. Her daughter Tamika would later remember her mother as a firecracker, outgoing, vibrant, and full of personality even during her darkest times. On October 23, 1988, Anna's body was discovered along Ontolone Trail near Reading. She had been harmed and left alongside the trail, with baling twine around her neck. The location was semi-remote, suggesting the perpetrator had chosen it deliberately to avoid immediate discovery. Investigators processed the scene and collected evidence, but the case quickly went cold. Anna's lifestyle meant she had encountered many people, making it difficult to narrow down suspects. Without clear leads or matches in criminal databases, the investigation stalled, and Anna's case joined the growing pile of unsolved matters in Berks County. Then, in 1990, something extraordinary happened. The Reading Eagle newspaper received an anonymous letter containing details about Anna Kane's case that had never been made public. The letter writer demonstrated intimate knowledge of the scene and circumstances surrounding Anna's final hours. Details only the perpetrator or someone directly involved would know. The letter seemed like a taunt, a way for someone to inject themselves into the investigation without fully revealing their identity. It was both a breakthrough and a frustration. Investigators now had confirmation that the letter writer was connected to the case, but they had no way to identify who had sent it. What investigators did have, however, was the letter itself. More specifically, they had the envelope. The sender had licked the envelope to seal it, leaving behind trace amounts of saliva on the adhesive. In 1990, DNA technology was still emerging, and extracting usable genetic material from saliva on an envelope was not yet routine practice. But investigators had the foresight to preserve the letter carefully, recognizing it might one day yield crucial evidence. That day came more than 3 decades later. By the 2020s, DNA extraction techniques had advanced dramatically. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations, offering hope to families who had waited years or even decades for answers. Anna's case was reopened, and forensic experts carefully extracted DNA from the envelope's seal. The genetic profile was uploaded to genealogical databases, and investigators began the painstaking process of building family trees to identify the letter writer. The genealogical research led to a man named Scott Grimm, who had been 26 years old at the time of Anna's passing and lived in Hamburg, not far from Reading. When investigators looked into Grimm's background, they found he had no arrest record for violent offenses. Nothing that would have put him in any criminal database back in 1988. This explained why the case had gone cold despite the collection of DNA evidence from Anna's clothing. Without a database match, that evidence had simply sat in storage, waiting for technology to catch up. Sergeant Nathan Trait, who worked the reopened investigation, later reflected on the importance of that letter, noting that what seemed like a small piece of evidence had turned out to be exactly what was needed to solve the case. The DNA from the envelope matched the DNA found on Anna's clothing, creating an unbreakable link between Grimm and the scene. There was only one complication. Scott Grimm had passed away of natural causes in 2018, several years before investigators identified him. While Grimm would never face trial or punishment for what he had done, the identification brought Anna's family the closure they had sought for 34 years. Anna's daughter, Tamika Reyes, expressed mixed emotions upon learning the truth. She mourned the mother she had lost at such a young age, reflecting on how challenging it had been to grow up without her mom. No resolution could erase those years of absence or the pain of not having her mother at important life moments. But knowing the truth about what had happened and who was responsible provided a sense of finality. The case raised interesting questions about perpetrator psychology. Why had Grimm sent that letter in 1990? Was it guilt, arrogance, or a need for attention? Without the opportunity to interview him, investigators could only speculate. Some experts suggested that letter writing in cases like this often stems from a desire to be recognized for what the person has done. a way of asserting control over the narrative even years after the fact. Others thought it might have been a form of confession, a way to unburden himself without fully taking responsibility. The anonymous letter served as Grimm's undoing. Had he never sent it, the case might have remained unsolved indefinitely. But that little piece of evidence, as Sergeant Trait noted, proved to be the key. It connected him directly to both the scene and to knowledge only the perpetrator would possess. In a strange twist of fate, Grimm's apparent need to engage with the investigation from the shadows had preserved the very evidence that would identify him decades later. That strange compulsion to reach out would be absent in the next case, where technology had to do all the talking. Helena Prushinsky. Helena Prushinsky was 21 years old in January of 1980, a junior at Wheaton College who had secured a coveted internship at Co radio station in Denver, Colorado. Helene was pursuing her passion for journalism and broadcasting, eager to learn the industry from experienced professionals. Friends and family described Helene as warm, kind, and exceptionally bright. Someone with a promising future ahead of her. She was exactly the kind of young person any parent would be proud of, working hard to turn her dreams into reality. On January 16, 1980, Helene finished her shift at the radio station and headed to catch a bus home. She waited at a bus stop in Englewood, Colorado, a routine she had followed many times before during her internship. But on this particular night, something went terribly wrong. Helene was approached and taken at knife point, forced from the relative safety of the public bus stop into a nightmare scenario. The perpetrator drove her to an isolated location, where she was harmed and then ended in a field near Castle Pines. The following day, her body was discovered, ending the desperate search her family and friends had launched when she failed to return home. The investigation began immediately, with Denver area law enforcement agencies coordinating their efforts. The scene yielded crucial forensic evidence that investigators carefully collected and preserved. Though the DNA technology available in 1980 was rudimentary at best, detectives interviewed potential witnesses, canvassed the area around the bus stop, and followed every lead they could generate. Despite their efforts, no clear suspect emerged. The case grew cold, and Helene's family was left with the devastating reality that whoever had taken their daughter might never be caught. For Helene's loved ones, particularly her sister Janet Johnson, the unsolved case became a constant source of pain. Janet would later testify about the impact of Helene's loss, describing how their hearts had been torn out and how she had cried herself to sleep countless nights over the years. Friend Kitsy Snow preserved journal entries from the days following Helene's disappearance, capturing the anguish of knowing something was very wrong and waiting for news that would never bring relief. The case remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades. Then, in 2017, investigators decided to take advantage of advances in genetic genealogy. The DNA profile from the crime scene was uploaded to public genealogical databases, and forensic genealogists began the meticulous work of building family trees to identify the perpetrator through his relatives. This process involved tracing branches of family trees back through multiple generations, then forward again to identify all living descendants of common ancestors. It was like solving a massive puzzle, using bits of information scattered across census records, birth certificates, and family trees that ordinary people had uploaded to trace their ancestry. The genealogical research eventually led investigators to a man named James Curtis Clanton, who had also used the alias Curtis White during his life. In 1980, Clanton had been 22 years old and living in the Denver area. He had no prior record of such offenses, which explained why his DNA had never appeared in any criminal database. After Helene's passing, Clanton had eventually relocated to Florida, where he had built what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary life, raising a family and working various jobs over the decades. In 2019, more than 39 years after Helene was taken from that bus stop, police tracked Clanton down in Florida and arrested him. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA match was undeniable, placing him at the scene beyond any reasonable doubt. During subsequent interviews, Clanton admitted that he had intended to harm Helene from the moment he approached her. He described forcing her to kneel before ending her life, a level of premeditation and callousness that shocked investigators even after decades of working difficult cases. In 2020, Clanton pleaded guilty to first-degree unlawful action in Helene's case. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, finally bringing a measure of justice to a case that had haunted Helene's family for 4 decades. While Clanton's arrest brought closure after decades, the next case would prove that even a confession letter couldn't undo the damage already done. Lisa Ziegert. Lisa Ziegert was 24 years old in April of 1992, working as a teacher's aide while pursuing her passion for art and dance in Agawam, Massachusetts. Those who knew Lisa described her as creative, joyful, and full of life. Someone who brought light into every room she entered. She loved working with young people and had a natural gift for connecting with them through art and movement. On April 15, 1992, Lisa was working an evening shift at Brittany's Card and Gift Shop, a small retail store in a strip mall where she often helped out to earn extra money. That evening, as closing time approached, something went terribly wrong. Lisa was taken from the card shop, leaving behind signs of a struggle, but no clear indication of who had been responsible or where she had been taken. Her family and friends immediately launched a desperate search, distributing flyers and organizing search parties throughout the Agawam area. The community rallied around the Ziegert family, hoping against hope that Lisa would be found alive. On Easter Sunday, April 19th, those hopes were crushed. Lisa's body was discovered in a wooded area, partially unclothed with defensive wounds, indicating she had fought for her life. The location suggested the perpetrator had planned carefully, choosing an isolated spot where discovery would be delayed. Forensic teams carefully processed the scene, collecting biological evidence that would prove crucial decades later. The case devastated the Agawam community and launched an intensive investigation that would span more than 2 decades. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people in the days and weeks following Lisa's discovery. They developed several persons of interest, including someone who would later become central to the case. In 1993, a woman approached police with disturbing information about her ex-husband, Gary Shara. She told investigators that Shara had exhibited troubling behaviors and had spoken about fantasies that aligned eerily with what had happened to Lisa. Despite this tip, investigators lacked the concrete evidence needed to pursue charges against Shara at that time. The case went cold, leaving Lisa's family in agonizing limbo. Years turned into decades, and the Ziegert family never stopped advocating for justice. They kept Lisa's name in the public eye, regularly reaching out to law enforcement and pushing for the case to remain a priority. Their persistence would eventually pay off in an unexpected way. By 2017, DNA phenotyping technology had advanced significantly. This technique uses genetic material to predict physical characteristics like eye color, hair color, skin tone, and facial structure, essentially creating a sketch of a suspect based purely on their DNA. Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping, created a composite sketch based on the perpetrator's DNA profile. The resulting image bore a striking resemblance to Gary Shara, the same man his ex-wife had named back in 1993. This renewed investigators' interest in Shara, and they began building a case to obtain his DNA through legal means. A grand jury issued an order compelling Shara to provide a DNA sample, and when the results came back, they confirmed what the phenotyping had suggested. Gary Shara's DNA matched the evidence from Lisa Ziegert's case. But before investigators could arrest him, Shara attempted to end his own life. He survived the attempt and was taken into custody once he had recovered sufficiently. During the investigation that followed his arrest, investigators discovered that Shara had written confession letters in 2017, apparently grappling with guilt over what he had done. In these letters, Shara claimed he had not intended to end Lisa's life, that events had spiraled out of his control. He described harboring fantasies about taking someone from the card shop where Lisa worked, but insisted the outcome had not been what he had envisioned. The letters revealed a disturbing window into Shara's psychology. He had apparently spent years thinking about committing such an act, visiting the card shop and planning how he might execute his fantasy. On April 15, 1992, he had finally acted on those impulses, taking Lisa from the shop and bringing his dark fantasies into reality. What he characterized as events spinning out of control was in reality the natural consequence of enacting a violent fantasy on a real human being who fought back and resisted. In 2019, Gary Shara pleaded guilty to first-degree intentional harm in Lisa Ziegert's case. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While Shara's fantasies led to one tragedy, the next case would show how everyday moments can turn deadly in an instant. Crystal Lynn Beslanovich. Crystal Lynn Beslanovich was 17 years old in December of 1995, a teenager from Spokane, Washington, who had fallen into difficult circumstances. Crystal had been living a challenging life since she was 15, struggling with substance issues and often having to fend for herself on the streets. On December 14, 1995, Crystal told acquaintances she was heading to a Circle K convenience store in Salt Lake City, a routine errand that should have been unremarkable. When Crystal failed to return, alarm bells rang among the people who knew her. Despite her difficult circumstances, she had people who cared about her whereabouts and noticed when she went missing. The following day, December 15th, Crystal's body was discovered on the banks of the Provo River. She had been struck repeatedly with rocks, a brutally simple method that spoke to either rage or opportunism. The riverside location was somewhat isolated, offering the perpetrator privacy to commit the act without immediate interruption. Investigators processing the scene faced a unique challenge. Unlike many cases where biological evidence comes from clothing or the victim's body, in Crystal's case, the weapons themselves, the rocks used in the assault, potentially held crucial DNA evidence. The perpetrator would have had to handle these rocks extensively, leaving behind skin cells, sweat, and possibly blood if they had injured themselves during the act. Police carefully collected the rocks and preserved them as evidence. Though in 1995, the technology to extract meaningful DNA from such surfaces was limited. Then came a breakthrough in forensic technology. In 2013, investigators decided to use a technique called MVAC, a specialized DNA collection system that uses sterile liquid in a vacuum environment to extract genetic material from difficult surfaces. The MVAC essentially washes the surface while simultaneously collecting the wash liquid, capturing microscopic amounts of DNA that traditional swabbing would miss. When applied to the rocks from Crystal's case, the MVAC pulled DNA that had been trapped in the stone's irregular surface for 18 years. The DNA profile was run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders across the country. The search returned a hit: Joseph Michael Simpson, a man with a prior conviction for ending someone's life. Simpson had been released on parole in 1995, just months before Crystal's passing. The timing was chilling. He had been freed from prison for one brutal act, only to allegedly commit another shortly thereafter. Investigators needed to confirm the DNA match beyond what the database had provided. Detective Todd Bonner took on the task of conducting surveillance on Simpson, waiting for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample for comparison. When Simpson discarded a cigarette, Bonner carefully collected it, and the DNA from that cigarette was analyzed against the profile from the rocks. The match was definitive. Joseph Michael Simpson had handled those rocks, placing him at the scene of Crystal's ending. Simpson was arrested and charged. In 2016, after a trial that lasted several days, a jury deliberated for 4 hours before convicting Simpson. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, finally being held accountable for what he had done to Crystal. From rocks that remembered to a trail that witnessed terror, the next case would span decades before revealing its secrets. Catherine Sposito. On a June day in 1987, 23-year-old Catherine Lawson, Kathy Sposito, decided to spend her afternoon hiking Thumb Butte Trail near Prescott, Arizona, a popular outdoor destination known for its scenic views and moderate difficulty. Kathy was a college student, someone who loved being active and experiencing the natural beauty of Arizona. Hiking alone on familiar trails was something many young people did in the 1980s, particularly in areas considered relatively safe. On June 13th, Kathy set out for what should have been a peaceful afternoon in nature. Instead, Kathy was ambushed on the trail by someone who attacked her with shocking intensity. The assault involved multiple methods. She was struck with a rock, beaten with a wrench, and the situation escalated from there. Other hikers on the trail that day heard screams, the kind that make your blood run cold. But by the time anyone could respond, Kathy had already lost her life at the scene. The brutality of the attack suggested either extreme rage or a perpetrator who was acting out violent fantasies, someone for whom simply harming wasn't enough. The investigation launched immediately, with Yavapai County Sheriff's deputies processing the trail and interviewing other hikers who had been in the area that day. The randomness of the attack was particularly terrifying for the community. This wasn't someone who had been targeted because of a personal connection or because of any specific characteristic. Kathy had simply been in the wrong place when someone dangerous happened to be there. The case sent shockwaves through Prescott, leading many hikers to reconsider going out alone or on isolated trails. Despite intensive investigation, no clear suspect emerged. The trail was public, accessible to anyone, and the perpetrator had apparently fled the scene without leaving obvious traces of identity. The case went cold, joining the ranks of unsolved matters that haunted the Prescott area. For years, Kathy's case remained a mystery, with investigators periodically revisiting it but finding no new leads to pursue. Then, in the early 2000s, DNA technology began offering new possibilities for cold cases. Evidence from Kathy's case was analyzed, and a DNA profile was developed. That profile was run through databases and compared to evidence from other cases, eventually linking to an assault that had occurred on another Arizona trail in 1990. The 1990 incident involved someone who survived, and DNA had been collected. The connection suggested a pattern. Someone who targeted individuals on hiking trails in isolated areas. The DNA evidence pointed to an individual named Brian Scott Bennett. In 1987, Bennett had been 16 years old, a high school student from Kentucky who had been living in the Prescott area. The following year, Bennett had withdrawn from school, and in 1989 he had deserted from the Army. His background included accusations related to other trail incidents, though he had been acquitted or faced no convictions in those cases. The pattern suggested someone with escalating behavior, someone who found opportunities on hiking trails to act out violent impulses. There was a significant complication in pursuing justice for Kathy. Brian Scott Bennett had ended his own life in 1994, 33 years before investigators identified him as Kathy's likely attacker. To confirm the DNA connection with certainty, authorities obtained permission to exhume Bennett's remains in 2022. The exhumation and subsequent testing confirmed the match. Bennett's DNA was present at Kathy's scene and matched the profile from the 1990 trail incident. Sheriff David Rhodes announced the findings publicly, stating that investigators had high confidence Bennett had been responsible for what happened to Kathy Sposito. The resolution brought some measure of closure to Kathy's family, though it came with the bitter reality that Bennett would never face trial or punishment for his actions. While that trail held dangers in plain sight, the next case would show how danger can hide in the most unexpected places. Nancy Anderson. Nancy Anderson was 19 years old when she moved to Honolulu in October of 1971, seeking independence and adventure in paradise. Originally from Colorado, Nancy embodied the optimism and wanderlust of early 1970s youth culture. She quickly found work at a McDonald's restaurant in the Ala Moana Center and secured an apartment on Aloha Drive, which she shared with her roommate Jody Spooner. Friends and family described Nancy as trusting and outgoing, someone who made friends easily and approached life with openness and enthusiasm. These qualities, while beautiful, may have also made her vulnerable in ways she never anticipated. On January 7th, 1972, Jody Spooner returned to their shared apartment to find water running inside. What she discovered next would haunt her forever. Nancy had been attacked in their home, sustaining numerous wounds, including one that proved fatal. The scene was initially confusing enough that some investigators wondered if it might have been self-inflicted, but the forensic evidence quickly dispelled that theory. This was clearly a case of intentional harm, carried out with shocking intensity. One crucial piece of evidence caught investigators' attention. A bloody towel found at the scene contained blood from both Nancy and her attacker. The perpetrator had apparently cut himself during the frenzied attack, leaving behind a mixed sample that would prove crucial decades later. In 1972, however, DNA analysis didn't exist. Investigators could type blood to some degree, but couldn't extract the kind of individual identification that modern DNA testing provides. The investigation initially focused on several potential suspects. Police interviewed cutlery salesmen who had been working the area, thinking the attacker might have used the pretext of selling knives to gain entry. They also looked into a man Nancy had been dating, but he had an alibi that cleared him. The case generated significant attention in Honolulu. 1972 Hawaii was still a relatively close-knit community where such incidents were shocking and rare. Despite extensive investigation, however, no arrests were made, and the case eventually went cold. Nancy's family, particularly her siblings, never stopped pushing for answers. In 2001, Nancy's sister Carol Sampson contacted authorities asking them to reopen the case, hoping that advances in DNA technology might finally yield results. The case was examined, but initial attempts to get database matches came up empty. The perpetrator, whoever he was, had apparently never been arrested for offenses that would have required DNA submission. In 2019, Nancy's brother Jack Anderson took a different approach, reaching out to forensic genealogist C.C. Moore, who had gained prominence for her work on high-profile cold cases. Moore specialized in using public genealogy databases to identify perpetrators through their family trees, even when the perpetrators themselves had never submitted DNA. The technique had revolutionized cold case investigation since 2018, and Jack hoped it might finally crack his sister's case. Moore's team uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to public databases and began the painstaking process of building family trees. They traced lines back through multiple generations, then forward again to identify living descendants. The process required matching the DNA evidence to the right age range, geographic location, and physical traits. Eventually, the genealogical work pointed to a man named Tudor Chirila, who had been 25 years old in 1972. The identification of Chirila shocked those familiar with the case. Chirila had been a graduate assistant at the University of Hawaii at the time of Nancy's passing, and had lived in the same neighborhood as Nancy. This proximity meant he would have easily seen Nancy coming and going, potentially watching her routines and waiting for an opportunity. Even more surprising, Chirila had gone on to have a successful career as Nevada's Deputy Attorney General, a position requiring public trust and responsibility. He had never been arrested for similar offenses, though his history did include one disturbing incident: a prior arrest for attempting to prevent a girlfriend from leaving him, though charges had ultimately been dropped. Chirila's son voluntarily provided a DNA sample that helped confirm the family connection. And in 2022, now elderly Chirila was arrested in Reno and extradited to Hawaii to face charges. The arrest of a former deputy attorney general for a 50-year-old case generated significant media attention, both for the age of the case and for the suspect's professional background. How had someone capable of such an act managed to build a career in law enforcement and legal work? Chirila was held at the Oahu Community Correctional Center while awaiting trial, but justice would ultimately be denied. On December 25, 2023, Chirila passed away in custody from complications including infections and various health conditions. Despite the lack of trial, the identification brought the Anderson family significant closure, while Hawaii's oldest cold case found resolution. Texas was about to close the book on one of its most haunting mysteries. Carla Walker. Carla John Walker was 17 years old in February of 1974, a cheerleader at Western Hills High School in Fort Worth, Texas, known for her bubbly personality and close relationships with family and friends. Valentine's season 1974 should have been a magical time for Carla. She attended a Valentine's dance with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, celebrating young love in the way teenagers do. On February 17th, after the dance ended, Carla and Rodney went to a bowling alley parking lot, a common hangout spot for local teens. What happened next would traumatize Rodney and devastate Fort Worth's sense of security. Someone approached the couple's car and attacked with shocking speed, striking Rodney unconscious with a pistol. As Rodney lay dazed and bleeding, the attacker dragged Carla from the vehicle. Her final words to Rodney were a desperate plea. "Rodney, go get my dad." Those words would echo in Rodney's mind for the rest of his life, a haunting reminder of his inability to protect her in that moment. The attacker fled with Carla, and despite immediate police response and extensive searching, she couldn't be found that night. 3 days later, on February 20th, Carla's body was discovered in a culvert near Benbrook Lake. The forensic evidence painted a horrific picture of what she had endured during those 3 days. She had survived for approximately 2 days after being taken, suffering tremendously before finally succumbing. The brutality of the case shocked even experienced investigators and left Fort Worth reeling. The investigation consumed Fort Worth law enforcement resources for months. One piece of evidence seemed promising. The attacker had dropped a magazine from a .22 caliber Ruger pistol during the struggle. Police traced recent Ruger purchases in the area and identified several potential suspects. One of these was Glenn Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old truck driver who had recently purchased a matching Ruger. When interviewed, McCurley claimed his gun had been taken from him, and he agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed. Based on this, investigators cleared him and moved on to other leads. The case went cold, but its impact on Fort Worth was lasting. Parents kept closer watch on their teenagers. Self-defense classes saw increased enrollment. The idea that someone could be taken from a public parking lot fundamentally changed how people viewed their safety. For the Walker family, particularly Carla's brother Jim, the unsolved case became a constant source of pain. Jim later reflected that Carla's ending had destroyed their family, shattering the innocence and joy that had defined their lives before February 17. In 2018, Jim Walker pushed authorities to re-examine the case using modern DNA technology. Evidence collected from Carla's clothing was sent to Othram Incorporated, a company specializing in advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. The DNA profile extracted from a bra strap was uploaded to genealogical databases, and investigators began building family trees to identify the perpetrator through his relatives. The genealogical work led investigators back to Glenn McCurley, the same man they had cleared in 1974 based on the polygraph results. This revelation was both validating and frustrating. McCurley had been interviewed during the initial investigation, but had slipped through due to the limitations of 1970s investigative techniques. Police obtained McCurley's DNA from discarded trash and sent it for analysis. When that proved consistent with the crime scene evidence, they obtained a court-ordered cheek swab for definitive comparison. The match was unequivocal. McCurley was arrested in 2020, 46 years after Carla's life had ended. The trial began in August 2021, and the evidence against McCurley was overwhelming. On day 3 of the trial, McCurley pleaded guilty, perhaps recognizing that conviction was inevitable. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the investigation and trial, authorities had searched McCurley's home and found the Ruger pistol that matched the magazine dropped in 1974, hidden away among his possessions. A chilling souvenir he had kept for nearly 5 decades. McCurley passed away in prison on July 15, 2023, less than 2 years into his sentence. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.